Gestalt Psychology. What was your experience in figuring out the pictures? What helped you perceive the interesting pictures? And how did you go about examining the pictures? Focus on the background, the foreground, the shape. When you look at the pictures in the activity, your mind followed certain principles of perception. Gestalt psychology is concerned with such principles. Gestalt psychology is a theory of mind and brain of the Berlin School. The operational principle of Gestalt psychology is that the brain is holistic, parallel, and analog, with self-organizing tendencies. Human eye sees objects in their entirety before perceiving their individual parts. Such, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When human beings look at a painting or a web page or any complex combination of elements, we see the whole before we see the individual parts that make up that whole. This idea of seeing the whole before the parts and even more the whole becoming more than the sum of its parts is Gestalt. They suggested that learners do not just collect information as is, but they actively process and restructure data in order to understand it. Gestalt theory was the initial cognitive response to behaviorism. It emphasized the importance of sensory wholes and the dynamic nature of visual perception. The term Gestalt means form or configuration. Contrary to the behaviorist approach to understanding the elements of cognitive process, Gestalt psychologists sought to understand their organization. The Gestalt effect is the form generating capability of our senses, particularly with the lines and curves. In psychology, Gestalism is often opposed to structuralism. The phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is often used when explaining Gestalt theory. The phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, is often used when explaining Gestalt theory, though this is a mistranslation of Kurt Kafka's original phrase. The whole is other than the sum of the parts. Gestalt theory allows for the breakup of elements from the whole situation into what it really is. The term refers to how visual input is perceived by human beings. Gestalt psychology was founded by Max Wertheimer and has been added to over the years by other authors. According to Max Wertheimer, we see something that's not really there, and Wertheimer's explanation is that we see the effect of the whole event that is not necessarily contained in the sum of the parts. An example of this is a Christmas light. Wertheimer's original observation was that we perceive motion when there is nothing more than a rapid sequence of individual sensory events, such as a series of lights flashing in sequence. Imagine a string of Christmas lights. Each light turns on and off in sequence along the string. We see the movement of light from one end of the string to the other, when in reality, nothing has moved. We see something that's not really there, and Wertheimer's explanation is that we see the effect of the full event that is not necessarily contained in the sum of the parts. Wolfgang Kohler and Insight Learning. Gestalt psychology adheres to the idea of learning taking place by discovery or insight. The idea of insight learning was first developed by Wolfgang Kohler, in which he described experiments with apes, where the apes could use boxes and sticks as tools to solve problems. Kohler gave the apes sticks which they used to rake food into the cage. Sultan, Kohler's very intelligent ape, was able to master a two-stick problem by inserting one stick into the end of the other in order to reach the food. A much more difficult problem which involved the stacking of boxes was introduced by Kohler. This problem required the ape to stack one box on another and master gravitational problems by building a stable stack. Only one of Kohler's apes, Sultan, could solve this problem. theory suggested that learning could occur when the individual perceives the relationships of the elements before him and recognizes these elements and comes to a greater understanding or insight. This could occur without reinforcement, and once it occurs, no review, training, or investigation necessary. On the other hand, Kurt Kafka, who is famous for his line, "The whole is other than the sum of its parts," believed that most of early learning is what he referred to as sensory motor learning, which is a type of learning which occurs after a consequence. According to Kafka, the highest type of learning is situational learning, which makes use of language. Another proponent of Gestalt psychology is Kurt Lewin. His theory, focusing on life space, adhered to Gestalt psychology. He said that an individual has inner and outer forces that affect his perceptions and also his learning. Inner forces include his own motivation, attitudes, and feelings. Such as in the slides, one may have difficulty perceiving both the gorilla and tiger if one is simply looking in the foreground and not the background. Gestalt laws of grouping. The principles of grouping are a set of principles in psychology first proposed by Gestalt psychologists to account for the observation that humans naturally perceive objects as organized patterns and objects. Gestalt psychologists argued that these principles exist because the mind has an innate disposition to perceive patterns in the stimulus based on certain rules. The first of this law is the law of similarity, wherein things that are similar are perceived to be more related than things that are similar. Second is the law of proximity. Things that are close to one another are perceived to be more related than things that are spaced farther apart. The law of closure. The mind's tendency to see complete figures or forms even if a picture is incomplete. We tend to look for a single recognizable pattern. We tend to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a space by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the picture. In the slides, do you see a panda, a tree, a butterfly, or perhaps the letter V, or a footprint? The law of pregnance. People will perceive and interpret ambiguous or complex images as the simplest form possible. The stimulus will be organized into a good figure as possible, such as in this slide. We perceive this as a symbol for Olympic, rather as a series of circles chained and linked into one another, or a line of wine glass. The law of good continuation. Individuals have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. People tend to draw a good continuous line. Elements arranged in a line or curve are perceived to be non-related than elements not in the line or curve. Law of figure and ground. Elements are perceived either as figure or ground. Do you see a woman in front of a mirror or a skull? Perhaps an image of Jesus on the bread? How about the mask kissing? Or a hand? What about the slides? The principle maintains that the human eye sees objects in their entirety before perceiving their individual parts. Gestalt psychology tries to understand the laws of our ability to acquire and maintain stable percepts in a noisy world. Gestalt psychologists stipulate that perception is the product of complex interactions among various stimuli. In the slides, do you see a woman clad in a coat, or perhaps an old woman, a princess, or a witch? What about the dog in the second slide? The six Gestalt principles not only influence perception, but they also impact on learning. According to Mario Polito, an Italian psychologist, writes about the relevance of Gestalt psychology to education. Gestalt theory is focused on the experience of contact that occurs in the here and now. It considers with interest the life space of teachers as well as students. It takes interest in the complexity of experience without neglecting anything, but accepting and amplifying all that emerge. It stimulates learning as experience and experience as a source of learning. It appreciates the affections and meaning that we attribute to what we learn. Knowledge is conceived as a continuous organization and rearrangement of the information according to the needs, purposes, and meanings. It asserts that learning is not accumulation, but remodeling or insight. Autonomy and freedom of the student is stimulated by the teacher. The time necessary for assimilation and for cognitive and existential remodeling is respected. The contact experience between teachers and students is given value, an authentic meeting based on sharing ideas and affections.